Medfield TV. Community shows.
Welcome to Talking Climate. I am Thea Iberol.
And I'm Fritz Fleischmann.
And we're broadcasting from Medfield TV, a public access television station from Medfield, Massachusetts.
In this series called Talking Climate, we interview scholars, students, activists, business people, activists who've come to the conclusion that climate change is something that is caused by humans and that we need to do something to address this issue. So these are all people who've taken steps that they hope will prevent global catastrophe.
And today our guest is Rabbi Katy Allen, the founder of the One Earth Collective and the president and founder of the Jewish Climate Action Network. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
So can you tell us something about how you personally came to the conclusion that you had to do something about climate change?
Well, I was just very blessed to have grown up in a rural area and have a very close connection to the natural world, a lot of experiences outdoors, and also a sense of the sort of sacredness of nature and the sense of the healing power of the natural world. And I started my career as a science teacher, actually, so I have a background in science, and I have known that this has been going on for a while. And eventually I reached the point where it's like I was sort of searching for where is it that I can fit in, what are the ways that I can be active in doing something about this that would feel to me like coming from a place of my own authentic self, because I think that's really important, that we have to kind of move into a place where we feel like we're really acting out of our own deepest sense of the world and ourselves. And through that process, I became involved in the transition movement and in the town where I live, Wayland, which is really about sort of very local kinds of initiatives and about taking into peak oil and climate change as two things that or just mean we have to do something, but to start at the very sort of nitty-gritty of building community and working together at the very local level. But I also really wanted to do something that was connected to my Jewish roots, and over a period of a couple of years sort of interested in trying to get the Jewish community together and sort of addressing this. And so eventually, together with Eli Gerson, who's actually no longer involved, he's doing other things, but we together founded the Jewish Climate Action Network, which has been a vehicle for partnering with synagogues and also just giving a Jewish framework and a Jewish voice to climate activism. And so I'm involved in those two things. And the One Earth Collaborative, which I'm involved in Framingham on the campus of Open Spirit, is a little bit like the transition idea in terms of being local and very sort of personal kinds of things, but is really about bringing our spirituality into our connection to the earth. And so we're doing gardening programs, composting programs, foraging programs, and just sort of very spiritual, like walks that help us make our spiritual connection to the earth.
That's a very broad range of activities. For those of in our audience who don't know what the transition movement is, could you say a little bit about what that is, what that means?
Yes, it started in England, and it's a local program where it's people get together locally, and the kinds of things that people do really depend on the particular community.
Mm-hmm.
So in Wayland, we have we do some community gardening. There's a beekeepers group. And there's also been involvement with Solarize and getting solar and renewable energy, and so connecting into the town-wide programming that way. There's a group in Framingham, they do a lot about, they have this Fresh Food for Framingham program that they do, so they're doing a lot about trying to create more gardens in Framingham. There's a program called Transition Streets, which is where neighbors get together and talk about, there's a whole program for like, what can I do in my home? And it's really all kinds of things that help build community. That's a whole piece of what it's about building community, sort of how do we become more resilient as we and get to know each other and support each other. So
the term transition really refers to transitioning to a more sustainable world.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
And you're talking to a lot of people and in lots of different contexts. Do you see, when you talk to them, are they engaged for different reasons in it, or is it all basically the same, or is it all over the place?
You know, I think that people who are engaged kind of get the bigger picture, that this is a real crisis. It's an existential crisis that we're facing about what is going to happen to life as we know it on this planet. And so people find the way to be active that works for them. But I think that sort of bigger picture is really behind everybody's actions. And some people want to engage in civil disobedience. Some people want to, get more gardens going. Some people want to be politically active and advocate. And we need all of it. That's kind of how I look at it. It's like, it's all good. Because I tend to believe we've kind of turned a corner. There's not really any full going back, but how we go forward is really, really, really important for us to be able to say, not only that we've done something and we've done what we've done our best, but also that we've done it in a way that is trying to be open-hearted and loving and connecting and as a way to just, sort of open our hearts as opposed to out of our fear closing our hearts and becoming inward.
Do you find in the, you do a lot of work in the interfaith communities and the faith communities, do you find there's special challenges there? Or is it everybody's focused on it?
Well, among activists, there's not really. I think the main challenge that people face is, for example, clergy who may be in a congregation where there's some people who see this as a political issue and they don't want you to talk about it. Climate deniers that may be part of their congregation. I think that's a real challenge for clergy. Like, how do they talk about it? So one rabbi, I know a young rabbi who's talked about the idea that really, because he's in that kind of situation, and he's saying, I think my example, what I do with my own life and how I lead in this area is like one of the most important things to do, is a way to show what I'm doing. It's a moral question, so it sort of fits very nicely within the framework of religious traditions, because it is, the idea of God's creation, and we're supposed to be like, this is sacred and taking care of it and doing things to help it be better and grow more, as opposed to, helping to destruct it. And where is my moral and religious and spiritual responsibility to the universe and also to other people and all the kinds of life.
Right. I mean, there's no question that it's an ethical issue. Even Pope Francis has called climate change an ethical issue. So spiritual people tend to be the ones who most easily see the big picture. Nevertheless, people have particular interests, particular concerns, particular fears, right? Some people have a pipeline built in the neighborhood, and that's what brings them to the conversation, right? Other people are concerned about water pollution or some other manifestation, or floods, droughts, what have you, right? Two of the biggest changes, though, one is how to build community, and you mentioned that there's something you're interested in. The other one is how to communicate about climate change, right? So in the work that you are doing, can you talk a little bit about how these two challenges are being addressed? So let's start with community building. Are there any particular issues that you have come across? Thea mentioned interfaith collaboration. That doesn't seem to be a big problem in the conversation. It could be. Are there any other challenges to community building, or is that do you find that an easy task?
So in this particular area, in this sort of greater Boston area, the interfaith community that's involved in climate action is just, there's a wonderful group of people. And I think that, any time you do any kind of interfaith work, you have to, be sensitive to other people and what they're, where they're coming from and what their religions are and so on. And I think there's a lot of I've seen a lot of sensitivity to that kind of thing in the people that are active in this interfaith world. In the Jewish world, we're, a group of volunteers we got some various programming that we're trying to get synagogues to sign on to a benchmarking campaign, that the idea being over the period of 7 years, the 7 years being this sort of cycle of 7 that we have in the Jewish calendar, and to radically reduce carbon emissions in synagogues. Now that's a big challenge in a lot of ways, but we are sort of gradually building a network of people from different communities around the greater Boston area, and trying to bring them together to support each other, to have conversations, to share things that worked, things that didn't work, and so by the fact that we're being this organization, this umbrella for the entire Jewish community, it's helping to make some communication happen between synagogues about things that are working or things that are not working, and we had one conference when we first started, and that was I think it was 2014, I think.
2015.
2015. Okay, 2015, which was a Climate and Judaism conference, and there were about 100 people that came to that. And that was really certainly a first for the New England area, to put sort of climate change and Judaism together in the same room. There's a lot more going down now, even just in the course of a couple of years since then. There's a lot more that's happening in the sort of national Jewish world around climate change. But getting it on the table, getting it something that you can talk about, telling educators and rabbis, providing resources about how you can talk about it or what kinds of things you can do. These are really important things too. So we had then, we're planning a program for this spring, which is going to be much more technical about, some resources for how to really do radical reductions, because the sort of more tech person who's involved in JCAN, Fred Davis, he's really pushing us to not think about little reductions, but to think about much bigger reductions. And then part of the idea, once you get a synagogue involved in that process, is that it also, it trickles in both directions. The people who are doing individual things at home, then come into that process, and by doing that process in a public way, then there are more opportunities and incentives. People get involved in doing things in terms of their own lives. So it's sort of community building in a lot of layers and levels.
Right.
And but what we're beginning to see is just much more conversation throughout the Jewish community about the whole thing, and that's a really good thing.
Right. What I was actually thinking about when I asked you that question is the various impediments to community building, right?
Yeah.
Because what holds you together obviously is a shared religious faith and orientation, right? That's the glue that holds the community together, and that's that's the glue, so to speak, that needs to overcome
Right.
what divides you. And what divides people is that they have specific interests, right? You might have a job in the fossil fuel industry. You might have a job for a company that makes products that that pollute, right? How to get those diverse interests together
Right.
is always the challenge,
It's
right?
very much of a challenge, and you know, the people who, obviously people get engaged in JCAN are people who are, you know, on board. But even just supporting those people in terms of going back to their communities where they may be confronted with that, or in terms of their conversations with their rabbis or whatever, just to know that they're not alone, that there's somebody behind, you know, I think those things help. And it's a challenge. I mean, it's a big challenge. I don't think there's any easy answers. I'm actually in the process of putting together a program a webinar that's going to be specifically for rabbis and educators about talking about climate change, and there'll be a number of rabbis with national names who are going to be on there, and I think it's going to, hopefully it will be helpful, because those are really tough questions. There's no easy answers to the questions, and I think it really is very specific to each community and each rabbi and how they talk to people, and you have to build it up slowly. You can't just like all of a sudden get up there and, you know, proclaim whatever and expect everybody to come along with you. You have to work with your community. And so that requires lay people and leaders working together. And that's, of course, the issue, which is that all of that takes time. All of that's a slow process. And frankly, you know, we need to like cut our carbon emissions like to
Immediately.
nothing right now.
Right.
So that's why I talk about the idea of how. And so what happens within that individual community, in the individual congregation or something, the how of it is really, really, really important. And the same with, you know, what we're doing in Wayland, or what we're doing at Open Spirit, or what, you know, anybody is doing anywhere that has something that addresses the issue of climate change. The how is like super important. We can't beat people over the heads. You know, we need to
Right.
pull people in. And the other thing, the other piece, which I think the religious community has a very important role in, is to address the spiritual crisis that people can be experiencing, the eco-despair, the eco-depression, to provide opportunities for people who are connected and who do see what's going on, and the grief and the despair and the hopelessness that can come along with that. And so that's also a place where, you know, it's a perfect, you know, shidduch, it's a perfect combination for religious communities to be involved in.
Let me highlight that for a second before we go on to the next question. I just read a book by a young philosopher who argues that you don't have to love nature, you don't have to have a spiritual anchor to it, you don't have to feel that you have an obligation to take care of creation, to be the steward of creation, as the Christians call it. And I was kind of taken aback by that argument, but it's justified in the sense that there are many people out there who actually have no connection to nature at all, who don't want to go out, they don't want to get bitten by mosquitoes and sleep on the ground and all that sort of stuff. But what you just said made me think of a different argument for why it's important for religious communities to get involved in this, precisely because in a community like that, people have a spiritual anchor, a place where they can feel that they have a sanctuary, psychological and philosophical sanctuary, right? So I think that whether or not somebody likes nature is not as compelling as the argument that you need to have a community in which you can be spiritually at home to deal with the crisis that we all face.
You know, and I think that is really true. And so, you know, in today's world, there are a lot of people who are not connected to, you know, specific religious or spiritual communities, or, you know, the gym may be their spiritual community or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, sort of non-attachments to the sort of traditional, you know, churches, synagogues. And so I think there's also a home for those people in you know, in the climate movement, which is inherently spiritual in the sense that it's about the universe. I mean, you have to be like thinking about beyond yourself in order to engage in it, and it's about the whole planet, and it's not about just what's right around me. And so there's sort of this piece of, and then there is this existential crisis, this question, you know, is humanity going to survive, which requires a sort of spiritual lens in some level to look. So even if you're not religious, there's a way for people to find a community of support that has a sort of inherently spiritual nature to it in the climate movement, which doesn't mean that everybody in the climate movement is spiritual. I don't mean to imply that. Or is, you know, thinking that way, but it's definitely there. And so.
But you're building a bridge. You're building a bridge to people who are not religious, who are not in a religious community, by saying spirituality is the experience of community, right? So you can be spiritual whether or not there's a transcendent connection or not.
Yeah. And one of the things that was really important to me when we started the Jewish Climate Action Network was to have the, you know, Jewish and climate action together in the same, you know, name, and that is both, you know, for people who are Jewish but might not be thinking climate action that has anything to do with Judaism. It's like, yes, here it is. And for people who are, you know, there's a lot of Jewish people involved in the climate movement who may not be affiliated, and to say, okay, yes, your community is there with you, at least on some level.
But you must have had some connection to nature since you became a biology teacher, so from early on you were really connected?
Definitely. It's always been a place of sanctuary for me. It's always been a place of intense pain when I see destruction of any level. And then, you know, some basis of knowledge too, of understanding has been helpful. So those things all together, it's always been spiritual for me in that way. And, you know, I lead people on services and walks and things outdoors all the time because, you know, like my feeling is when you pray outdoors, there's like nothing in the way. It's just, for me, much more direct.
So what do you get more pleasure out of, or more sense of deep connection? Is it from doing more political activist work, or the nature walks, or the talking to people about they're starting their gardens, and you know, there's so many levels that you're working at.
Right. And so the political things, the action things, those are all outside my comfort zone.
Are they?
Those are things that I do because I feel like we have to do that. And I feel, you know, kind of a moral and religious and spiritual obligation to do those things. But in terms of my own self-renewal and making sure that I maintain the strength to do that, you know, taking people on a moonwalk is, you know, one of the ways that I do that. Leading a service outdoors is one of the ways that I do that. So those are things that nourish me, and, you know, and getting people psyched about composting or something, you know, those things really nourish me at a very personal level and help give me the strength to do the things that are sort of more of a stretch for me. But I think that, you know, I've over the course of my years of activism, that stretching has made me grow more comfortable in those areas, and I think that's what we all need to be doing. We all need to be stretching ourselves, which is what we need to be doing as human beings anyway, but in the face of climate change, you know, all the more so.
Now, the One Earth Collective, is that, you were talking about, is that part of the these nature walks, and you were talking about the gardening, and is that
so
what
Open
it
Spirit in Framingham is a kind of a multi-faith, mind, body, spirit center where there's a lot of interesting sort of spiritual and interfaith things happen. And so that's where the One Earth Collaborative is housed. And so that's on the campus of this Edwards Church, a UCC church in Framingham, and one of the things that's really wonderful that's happening is that we're sort of gradually converting what was just this, okay, just grass is the easiest thing to take care of, and there's a permaculture garden going in, and this year there's going to be we brought in another project that's going to be a whole gardening project. The food's going to go to a food pantry. The kids at risk are going to take care of the garden. There's somebody else who's going to be running that, but we brought her in. We've got a community compost. We've got right now a community, we're starting a community sugar bush. We're tapping the maple trees, but the idea is that anybody can come and take a bucket of sap and either boil it down to syrup, it's a lot of boiling it takes that, or you can, apparently you can buy for a lot of money a bottle of maple drink that's basically maple sap. Well, you can get it for free from these trees. So, it's like another part of the permaculture garden is these maple trees that are already there, and let's harvest them and see where it goes with that. And foraging is, I just delight in learning, like there's weeds out there and we can eat those weeds, it's like that's the most local kind of food you can get is the weeds. You don't even have to plant them, and I just delight in that. And there's a lot of good stuff out there, so I'm gradually learning that, bringing out other people who are more knowledgeable but it's like foraging is a spiritual practice, not just, I'm going out there foraging, but all of these things is this acknowledging the spiritual aspect of all of it. Composting is a great metaphor, you put your garbage in and you bring out this rich, wonderful compost. That's what we all need to do with life, it's like a metaphor for life. So all of these things, I sort of facilitate it. I don't run all of it, but help other people do it, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. So that's sort of the hands-on kind of.
Right.
This reminds me of a Sufi mystic, Attar, who talks about this homesteading, which is, taking care of family as a spiritual thing. I mean, you can be a spiritual leader doing that, and it's just as valid as heading up some.
Oh, exactly. I think it's really really important. I mean, Transition Framingham, together with the Framingham Libraries, they've got a seed library going now. It's a great thing, it's continuing these seeds into the next generation.
Medfield Library has that also.
How beautiful can you get?
Right, so connectedness is what it's about,
really,
right?
like
And also between the generations. And you mentioned an important point, which is that education is such an important part of the climate conversation, right? And education is also, of course, historically a very important element of any Jewish community, right? Is it not? As is the concern with justice. Can you tell us a little bit about any conversations that are going on in these communities to which you belong about climate justice? Is that a topic?
That is absolutely a critical part of the conversation, because it is totally true that the most vulnerable populations are the most at risk in terms of climate impact too. And that's part of that, looking beyond ourselves and even looking beyond maybe our own community to where are the most vulnerable populations. It's such an incredible justice issue around the world, but even locally. And for example, who was most impacted by the incredible snow we had a few years ago? People who relied on the tea, and then there was no tea and no way to get to work, or people who were at their most vulnerable are the ones who are most impacted, and that's always going to be true. Those of us who are in more of a place of privilege and upper economics and so on, we're more able to protect ourselves. And there's also a big effort now going on towards community solar, like. Not just solar should be available to people who can put it on their roofs, but also for create ways for community for that to be spread to the community, to the larger community, to people who wouldn't be able to do an upfront cost. So there's a lot of efforts that are going, a lot of things that are happening and making it more accessible. So there's a lot of different ways that the justice issues need to be addressed, and think there's even a bill before the state legislature right now that has to do with this economic justice in relation to solar and renewable energies.
Right.
Yeah, so it's.
And you're involved with the food program also? Is there a Jewish food program that?
Well, there's a Jewish food conference every year, and that covers just about any issue you can think of that's related to food and Judaism, the intersection of food and Judaism. So JCAN always does a program that in some way has to do with how is food and climate change connected, whether it's, you know, going towards a more vegan diet, or I think it's about the climate impact of foods, you know, the different foods that we eat, and, you know, various variations on that theme, because there is significant impact by what we eat. So.
Have you ever counted up the number of organizations that you are connecting with and involved in?
I know, I seem to have a penchant for, but it's interesting because I feel like together they create the web of what is important to me, and that's great. So, you know, I was only for a short time in a synagogue, but I worked mostly as a chaplain, and I worked hospital chaplaincy and hospice chaplaincy. And I feel like there's a real role for that chaplain, the sort of person who walks beside you, the person who kind of holds the space in this movement, because, first of all, because of the sort of spiritual nature of it, but second of all, you know, like even getting the Jewish Climate Action founded, it sounds like a whole activism thing, but in my mind there's a whole chaplaincy piece of it, because it's about creating this space so that people who need to do this work can come together and do this work, and that's just about holding the space for other people to do the work too, and sort of be a and then also in terms of, you know, holding the pain and the despair and everything that people have. There's a real role for this sort of chaplaincy training of standing in the tension and being a non-anxious presence. That's really important.
It's an important time for us to minister to each other, to take care.
Right.
So out of the many activities in which you are involved, which ones would you say so far have had the greatest impact?
That's an interesting question. In terms of impact, I guess that we could look at impact in a variety of ways. I would not say that there's anything that is making the big enough difference to turn around the course of climate change. But I know that the Jewish Climate Action Network presence is being powerful, sort of in a way even beyond what we actually do, just by existing. I think there's a real importance to that. At the big climate march in New York, we had this big banner, and it was like about a year later that a woman connected with us and was like, oh my gosh, this is the organization that I saw this banner in New York, and I was like so excited that there was, you know, it's just like you never know where or when you're touching somebody, and somebody who was like, oh, I'm so thrilled that you guys exist, you know, even if they're not involved. And I think in terms of the very local pieces of things that I do with the One Earth Collaborative and other things, that there's just, you know, I think it just is very supportive for people and helps people kind of feel connected and go on.
Right, so let me be a little bit more specific. You immediately picked apart my question, as you should, because it's so multidimensional, right? So impact could be, what does it do for you? What, you know, how good is it for your own soul? The other direction could be, which of these many activities is most effective in giving comfort and space and solace to people who need it, right? Of course, no one individually is going to turn anything around. I mean, that's a given, right? I mean, climate action always has to be collective. I mean, we do
Right.
individual things. I
Right.
also have my compost bins, but that's not going to turn things around. It's just part of what we do, right? So let me ask the question again. Out of the many things that you do, gardening, teaching, being a chaplain to people,
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask you a personal question. Which one gives you the most satisfaction?
Well, I think it's really the combination, because each one is different, and they sort of feed the different parts of my soul in different ways. And that's why I keep doing all of them, because
Mhm.
they're all really important to me, each in its own way. And I see each one making a difference in other people's lives, or in the lives of the community in some way, and that's really gratifying too. So it's part of that, this benchmarking. We started out with this energy benchmarking with the Jewish Climate Action Network, but I kind of always had in my head this idea of a holistic benchmarking, and I eventually, after thinking about that for a long time, I wrote it out, and I don't know if I can remember all the pieces, but I'm like, if you're going to really take the pulse of your community and see where you are and support yourselves as a community and going forward, what are the things that you, in relation to climate change, what are the things that you need to be aware of? So they relate to your energy consumption, the way that food and waste go through your community, where your finances are. You know, are they invested in banks that are investing in the Dakota Access Pipeline, so on and so forth. Your education, both Jewish education related to climate change and scientific education. Your spirituality, where are people spiritually? I'm not going to remember the others.
Yeah.
There's a couple more. But anyway, they're all, it's like we're each of us a whole person, and then we're part of a community that's a whole. And so we have to look at the entire web in order to maintain our well-being. I think advocacy and action was another part of it. How much is your community getting out there and advocating? So, you know, all these things. And it's interesting because in synagogues, it is often the connection between the Green Team and the Social Justice Committee that when those two get together, climate change is the perfect nexus there. So
Absolutely.
and things that we do make a difference. There's a program that we have, it's called Decarbonizers, and there was one program like this, and afterwards there was, and the idea being, you get people from your local community. So somebody who's got solar or hot water, somebody who's got a solar array, somebody who's got electric cars, somebody who's got a heat pump in their home, and you know, each of these people tells about it and what they did and how they did it. The person who organized that first one, like 2 days later, somebody wrote, "Guess what? I just went out and got myself a solar array or something." This is somebody. It's like I've been thinking about it for a while, but you know, it was the nudge I needed to go forward.
So I created action.
Yeah, and I think that's what it's a constant thing of just creating enough web of all sorts of things happening that people suddenly get nudged from one place to another and farther forward and taking some action that they might have thought about but hadn't done.
That's
So
wonderful.
we have to ask the last question as we
Okay.
come to the end.
Okay.
Can't believe it, it's gone so fast. So when you think about the state of the world in 20 years, what makes you worried and what makes you hopeful?
Well, I'm very worried. I'm very worried because climate change, one of the sort of bigger impacts of climate change, it impacts migration and create, when people are needing and wanting, it's a source of conflict. So that's, I think, where a lot of my concern comes from, is the potential sources for increased conflict because of reductions in resources or changes in where resources are availability, or rising tide, rising oceans and things like that. But my biggest hope comes in what I see in people who are dedicating so much of their heart and their time and their energy to caring about what happens to everybody and to the planet. And that's what we need to kind of capitalize in. That's the part that is most important, to nurture that and to strengthen that and to build resiliency within not only physical resiliency, like what do we do when floods come, but our spiritual and our emotional and our communal resiliency to survive and to change and to adapt and to become in a different kind of relationship to the planet and to each other. And I see people working on that all around the globe, and I think that's where our hope is, that we find some kind of a transition that makes the best of our human spirits.
And hope is what we need. This is Medfield TV, Talking Climate. Thank you, Rabbi Katy Allen.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
This is Fritz Fleischmann and
And
Thea
Thea
Eberall. Until the next time, thank you.
Thank you.
The preceding was a production of Medfield TV.